Hello and welcome to the very first edition of Hopeful Fridays. This is our series looking at sustainability success stories and forms part of our Eco-vember 2020, where we're spending the whole month of November highlighting some environmental issues and also looking at the solutions around those. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at the wolves of Yellowstone National Park. So let's go ahead and get started. Our story starts back in 1925 when the very last wolf of Yellowstone National Park was shot and killed by hunters. And this led to a gradual change in the ecosystem that saw a decline in the biodiversity and a change in the very landscape of the national park. One of the biggest effects came on the population of elk in the national park. The wolves are the top predator in the ecosystem, and they would hunt the weak, the young, the elderly elk as part of their natural food chain. Without that top predator, the elk went through massive boom and bust cycles in their population, where they would feed extensively on the grassland, chomping back any young saplings of trees that were growing, chomping back any shrubs that were growing. And this allowed them to reproduce, so their numbers would skyrocket. But the grasslands couldn't sustain those massive increases in the elk population, and that would lead to a big decline in the number of elk, and the population would decrease. So we would see over the years massive increases and decreases in the elk population. But also other animals and other species that used to be found in Yellowstone National Park started to decline as well. In 1995, scientists decided to reintroduce a pack of wolves to Yellowstone National Park. They carefully monitored and carefully tracked a pack of 40 wolves, but they studied the wider effects that this reintroduction of the wolves had on the ecosystem. As expected, the population of elk began to decrease because the wolves hunted and killed the elderly and the weak and the very young. And this led to a stabilisation of the elk population at around 6,000 to 8,000. Whereas before we would have these boom and bust cycles, and there would be massive changes in the elk population year on year. The reintroduction of the wolves also had some other effects. The very tree line of the forests started to increase again. The reason being was that the elk, used to grazing in the open on these grasslands, were now being scared off by the wolves into the shelter of the forests. And this allowed those young saplings of trees to develop into full adult trees and developed much more shrubland to grow and become a habitat for lots of other wildlife. These young trees actually provided more shade over the rivers, and so fish started to come back into the rivers. With the increase in fish population, that then increased the number of bears that were coming to the woodland. The increased fish population also led to an increase in the number of beaver in the river. And they would build dams, which would change the very course of the rivers themselves. So just through this one introduction of the wolves back into the ecosystem, it led to what we call a cascade of events that increased the biodiversity in Yellowstone National Park. From the biodiversity in the woodland, the biodiversity in the river, to the biodiversity on the grasslands. And so now in Yellowstone National Park, we have got this stable level of elk population, stable levels of the wolf population. We've seen bears come back to the national park. We've seen bison come back because they're no longer being outcompeted by the elk for food. We've seen beaver come back. We've seen fish come back into the rivers. That's the story of the wolves of Yellowstone National Park and how their reintroduction helped to improve biodiversity. In next week's episode, we're going to be looking at the ocean ecosystems and how we can protect those. To finish with, I'm going to leave you with your weekend mission, which this weekend is very simple, just to have a conversation with someone at home, with one of your friends, about Eco-vember 2020, and want you to explain to them why environmental issues are important to you. Because the more we spread the word, the more likely it is that people are going to take action. Stay positive, have a good weekend, and I'll see you next time.